The night was shrouded in a thick blanket of darkness, only punctuated by the bursts of lightning that tore through the sky over Chicago. The wind howled through the streets, carrying a sense of foreboding that seemed to materialize in the heavy, charged air. It was a storm like few others, and James was in the middle of it. James had gone out for a quick run along Lake Michigan, an escape for his tired mind. But the storm, which had seemed harmless at first, abruptly intensified. The clouds, once gray, were now turning purple and turbulent, as if the sky itself were in a rage. With a deafening roar, a lightning bolt split the sky and struck James with brutal force. He felt an intense pain, as if his cells were being set on fire and then instantly frozen. The world spun around him, and he fell to the ground, his body trembling and his senses clouded. When he finally managed to get up, the chaos of the storm still raged around him. James was disoriented, but something was clearly wrong. The sky seemed to pulse with an energy he couldn't understand. The rain fell with an intensity that seemed almost supernatural, and the city lights, usually so familiar, flickered in strange and erratic patterns. Looking around, he began to see indistinct shapes moving among the shadows. They were like ethereal figures, dancing between the rain and the darkness, almost as if the storm were trying to conceal them. He blinked, trying to clear his vision, but the shapes persisted. The city lights began to merge into strange and unsettling forms, as if they were being manipulated by an invisible force. James tried to calm himself, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. He felt an inexplicable chill run down his spine, a sensation not just caused by the storm. A whispering voice, almost inaudible, seemed to murmur in his ears, blending with the sound of the wind and the rain. Without fully understanding what was happening, James began to walk toward his car, trying to ignore the strange feelings that haunted him. But what he didn't know was that this storm was not just a natural phenomenon. The impact of the lightning had triggered something far beyond his comprehension, and that night, Chicago would become the stage for a story that would challenge reality as he knew it. In the days following the lightning strike, James tried to get back to his routine, but something had changed inside him. Normal no longer seemed normal, and the world around him appeared to have an ethereal quality, as if he were watching life through a distorted veil. He walked through the streets of Chicago, trying to find comfort in the familiarity of his daily life. But at every corner, in the shadows of the streets, and in the flickering lights of shop windows, he began to notice something peculiar. Figures that had once been mere shadows and now seemed to have a presence, a consciousness of their own. They were like wandering specters, always at the edge of his vision, disappearing when he tried to look at them directly. At night, the feeling intensified. When he tried to sleep, it was as if dreams merged with reality. He saw vague shapes floating around his room, translucent figures contorting and whispering incomprehensible words. He would wake up with his heart racing, cold sweat running down his forehead, and a sense that something was there with him, something that shouldn't be. In a particularly disturbing moment, James was in a local cafe, trying to distract himself with a hot coffee. The soft light of the place seemed to change, and the shadows on the walls began to stretch and move in nonsensical ways. He saw an indistinct figure, a silhouette that seemed to stretch and contract as he tried to focus on it. Its movements were erratic, as if struggling to stay within the plane of reality. Desperate, he closed his eyes and tried to concentrate, but the images continued to haunt him. When he opened his eyes again, the figures were still there, but now they were more defined, with more concrete and threatening shapes. They seemed to be trying to communicate something, but the message was a jumble of thoughts and images that made no sense. Each day, the visions became more intense and frequent. The city lights seemed to blink in patterns that grew increasingly chaotic, as if trying to send a coded message. James felt in a constant state of surveillance and despair, unable to discern what was real and what was a product of his disturbed mind. The visions were not just frightening, they were unsettling, and he couldn't escape the feeling that they were preparing for something much bigger. James was on the brink of madness, trapped between reality and a world of shadows that seemed more and more real. The city of Chicago, once his safe haven, now felt like a labyrinth of mystery and terror, and he was about to discover that the visions were just the beginning of something much deeper and more disturbing. Nights in Chicago had become a constant nightmare for James. What had once been mere visions were now becoming real interactions. The shadowy figures he saw all the time were starting to take on a more concrete and menacing form. He knew something was wrong, but what was more disturbing was the feeling that these entities were not just observers. They seemed to be closing in, shaping the reality around him. It was on a particularly sinister night that James had his first direct encounter with the unknown. He was walking along the lakefront trail, seeking an escape from the city, when a thick fog began to form, obscuring the path ahead. The atmosphere was heavy and dense, as if the air were charged with oppressive electricity. As he moved forward, the fog parted to reveal a tall, skeletal figure, surrounded by a bluish glow. The figure hovered a few inches above the ground, its presence radiating a chill that seemed to penetrate James's bones. He stopped instantly, feeling a deep and primal terror that he couldn't explain. The figure, or whatever it was, seemed to be watching him with a penetrating intensity. Its eyes were like wells of darkness, and its form was ill-defined, as if it were constantly shifting. It was impossible to discern an expression, but James clearly sensed the presence of an ancient and malevolent intelligence. Suddenly, the figure emitted a sound, a low, indecipherable murmur that seemed to resonate directly in James's mind. The words were vague and distorted, mixed with a noise that seemed to come from another world. James felt his mind twisting under the influence of the entity, as if it were trying to push unknown thoughts and feelings into his consciousness. The sensation was so intense that James fell to his knees, his head spinning from the mental force of the experience. He tried to concentrate, to escape what felt like a direct assault on his sanity. With a desperate effort, he closed his eyes and clung to his own reality, trying to resist the influence. When he finally opened his eyes again, the figure had disappeared, and the fog had lifted. James stood up trembling, his heart pounding uncontrollably. Fear and confusion overwhelmed him. He knew he wasn't just dealing with a simple hallucination or nightmare. What he had encountered was something much deeper and more disturbing. This experience left James with more questions than answers. He knew he had been confronted by something that transcended human understanding. Something that was not just a physical threat but a force capable of manipulating and controlling minds. And now, he was racing against time to understand the true nature of these entities and what they really wanted from him. James knew he couldn't ignore what he had seen. The strange figure that attacked him in the fog wasn't an isolated incident, it was part of something much bigger, something he needed to understand in order to survive. Determined to uncover the truth, he began to investigate further, delving into the legends and mysteries of Chicago. His first clue led him to an old city library, a place filled with dusty volumes and ancient manuscripts. He spent hours among the books, analyzing stories and urban legends that seemed to match his visions. It was in an old journal, hidden among the shelves, that he found an account that caught his attention. The journal spoke of a secret cult that, according to the author, worshipped otherworldly entities and had operated in Chicago over a century ago. The legend mentioned the Clown Man, a sinister figure that had supposedly been seen in the city's shadows, associated with unexplained disappearances and supernatural events. James remembered hearing similar stories about Chico from the catacombs, a local myth about an invisible and threatening presence haunting the subterranean depths of Chicago. Motivated by these discoveries, James decided to investigate further. He began exploring the city's underground tunnels, a vast network of hidden passages and chambers dating back to the Prohibition era. These tunnels had been used for smuggling and were known for being complex and dangerous labyrinths. As he ventured through the dark galleries and damp passages, James felt an unsettling presence, as if he were being followed. The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, but he couldn't see where they were coming from. He kept moving forward until he found an ancient altar and a series of symbols carved into the walls, symbols he recognized from the journal. The symbols were complex and intricate, with shapes that seemed to dance and change under the light of his flashlight. James felt a chill as he realized that these symbols were used to invoke and communicate with the entities he had encountered. The atmosphere was charged with a sense of malevolent energy, as if the air itself was imbued with the influence of invisible entities. In the middle of the altar, there was a series of ritualistic objects and an old book, covered in dust and cobwebs. James leafed through the book, finding detailed descriptions of the cult and its practices, as well as information about the invisibles they worshipped. It was clear that these entities were not just legends, they had a real presence and a powerful influence over the city. The most disturbing revelation was that the cult believed these entities were ancient and powerful, with the ability to control human minds and manipulate reality. James was beginning to understand that the visions and the feeling of being controlled were not just coincidences. He was at the center of a sinister plot, where forces he didn't understand were at play. James knew he needed to find a way to confront these entities and, more importantly, discover how to stop the cult from achieving its dark goals. What had started as a series of disturbing visions was now revealing itself as a much more complex and terrifying conspiracy, and he was determined to unravel it, no matter the cost. Each passing day, James felt his control over his own mind slipping further away. The cult and the invisible entities were no longer just old stories or urban legends, they were actively shaping his reality and perception. What had started as sporadic and unsettling visions had now become a constant battle for his sanity. He often woke up in the middle of the night, drained and panicked, his mind tumultuous with thoughts and images that weren't his. Confused memories of things he had never done mixed with a deep and growing fear. The feeling of being manipulated was overwhelming, and he began to question whether he still had control over his own thoughts. One night, while trying to focus on a journal he had started keeping, James was suddenly hit by an intense vision. The shadows in the corner of the room extended and grew denser, forming a figure that seemed to speak directly to him, although its words were incomprehensible. He tried to move away, but it felt as though he was physically trapped, unable to move a muscle. The entity, or whatever it was, began to whisper commands and suggestions into his mind, implanting ideas and thoughts he didn't recognize as his own. The influence was so strong that he found himself making decisions he would normally consider unthinkable. In an inexplicable impulse, he found himself at the front door, stepping out into the night towards a place he didn't know, guided by a force he couldn't understand. The nights had become a battleground between James and the forces trying to dominate him. He fought to maintain a sense of normality, but it became increasingly difficult to distinguish what was real and what was manipulation. In a moment of desperate clarity, James began writing a letter to himself, trying to record every detail of his experiences and thoughts while he still had enough control to do so. It was then that he made a shocking discovery. In his notes, he found a reference to an old myth about the invisibles, an ancient belief that these entities could infiltrate people's minds and make them act according to their own desires. James realized he was in the midst of a mental battle where these entities were trying to turn him into a pawn in their sinister plans. Determined to regain control, James decided to confront his own illusions and the influence of the entities. He searched his records and found an old ritual described in the book he had discovered in the tunnels. The ritual promised to create a mental shield against external influence, something he hoped would be his only chance to free himself from the entity's control. On a full moon night, James performed the ritual in his apartment, surrounding himself with protective symbols and reciting the words he had deciphered. The atmosphere was charged with tension, and he felt a growing resistance as he tried to carry out the ritual. The entities reacted, increasing their influence, trying to prevent James from completing the process. The climax of the ritual was an exhausting mental struggle. James felt as if he were being pulled in opposite directions, his mind stretched and molded by the invisible force. However, with fierce determination, he managed to complete the ritual. A bright light filled the room, and the dark voices and figures disappeared. James was exhausted, but he had achieved a victory. He had regained a tenuous control over his own mind, but he knew the battle was far from over. the entities and the cult were still out there, and he needed to prepare for the next stage of this terrifying journey. The temporary relief James felt after the ritual was short-lived. The sensation of being free from the entities was merely a facade. He knew he needed to fully understand the connection between them and the city to ensure his safety. The final clue seemed to be hidden in the deep underground tunnels of Chicago, where he had found the altar and symbols. One afternoon, with renewed determination, James returned to the tunnels. The entrance was concealed behind a rusty structure in a dark alley, which he had found during his research. He descended the stairs, the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. The darkness was almost palpable, and the air was heavy with the smell of dampness and decay. As James went deeper, the silence grew more oppressive, interrupted only by the sound of dripping water. He used a flashlight that illuminated the ancient stone walls, revealing graffiti marks and symbols carved long ago. The tunnel seemed like an endless maze, with each turn and junction leading him further into the darkness. After hours of wandering through the passages, James arrived at an area that appeared to be a large underground chamber. The ceiling was high and arched, supported by ancient columns that seemed on the verge of collapsing. The floor was covered with a layer of dirt and debris, and to James's surprise, he saw a series of strange inscriptions on the walls. He approached a particularly intriguing wall, where he found a series of images depicting an ancient ceremony. The figures were drawn in a rudimentary style, but the symbolism was clear: otherworldly entities summoned through ancient rituals, controlling people's minds. It was a depiction of the same entities he had faced. James realized that these entities were not just ghosts or beings from another dimension but part of a larger plan. They had influenced and manipulated the city of Chicago for generations, using the cult as a means of control. The city had been a hub for these occult forces, and the tunnels were an essential part of their network of influence. Exploring further, he found a series of hidden rooms and chambers, each more sinister than the last. In one of them, he discovered an old record book, covered in dust and spider webs. The pages were filled with detailed notes about past cults and rituals performed to maintain the entity's influence. A secret compartment opened when James touched a specific symbol, revealing a hidden compartment containing a complex mechanical device. It was an ancient artifact, with gears and strange symbols he couldn't fully decipher. James felt a chill as he realized the artifact was connected to current events, as a means to amplify the entity's influence over the city. As he examined the device, James was overcome with a sense of urgency. He knew he needed to uncover the artifact's ultimate purpose and how it related to the manipulation of minds in the city. Time was running out, and the entities still had the power to shape the reality around him. James left the tunnels with a mixture of determination and fear. He now had a clearer view of what he was facing, but he also knew that the real battle was just beginning. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, and he needed to act quickly to prevent the cult and the entities from carrying out their dark plans. James had delved deeply into the mysteries of Chicago, but discovering the tunnels and ancient symbols was just the tip of the iceberg. He knew that to truly confront the entities and the cult's plans, he needed to learn more about the secret organization behind it all. His next objective was to find and dismantle the cult. The clues led him to an old, isolated mansion on the outskirts of Chicago, a decaying Victorian building that seemed to have been forgotten by time. Known to only a few, the mansion had a sinister reputation among locals, mentioned in whispers and rumors as a place where strange things happened. James managed to infiltrate the mansion on a rainy night, using the storm as cover to avoid detection. He entered through the back door, an entrance that seemed to have seen little use. The interior was a maze of dark corridors and dust-covered furniture. The walls were adorned with tattered tapestries and old paintings that seemed to watch his every move. Following the sounds of whispers and footsteps, James arrived at a large underground meeting room. The room was lit by candles in old candelabras, casting a flickering light that projected dancing shadows on the walls. In the center of the room was a ritualistic altar, covered with symbols similar to those he had found in the tunnels. cult members were gathered around the altar, all dressed in dark robes and hoods that concealed their identities. Their murmurs and chants in unknown languages reverberated through the room, creating an atmosphere of tension and anticipation. At the center of the ritual, one of the members was leading a ceremony aimed at invoking the presence of the entities James knew so well. James hid in the shadows, watching with a mix of horror and fascination. He saw that the ceremony involved a series of meticulous and complex steps, including the use of ancient artifacts he had found in the tunnels. The cult was trying to strengthen the connection between the physical world and the realm of the entities, expanding their control over the city and its inhabitants. As he watched, James overheard fragments of conversation between the cult members. They spoke of renewing power and expanding influence, also mentioning a sacrifice scheduled for the following night. James understood that the cult planned to perform a final ritual that could solidify their control over Chicago and allow the entities to completely dominate people's minds. Urgency grew within him. He knew he needed to act quickly to prevent the cult from completing their ritual, and that the next night might be his last chance to avoid a total disaster. With a plan in mind, James prepared to sabotage the ritual and expose the cult. But the mansion was filled with cult members, and any misstep could mean his capture or, worse, his own subjugation to the entity's influence. James used his stealth skills, preparing for a direct action against the cult. His mind was full of strategies and plans as he readied himself for the final battle against the cult and its dark forces. The night promised to be long and fraught with challenges, and James knew that the fight to save Chicago was about to reach its climax. The night was dark and oppressive as James prepared for his final assault on the mansion. He had meticulously planned every move, knowing that any mistake could cost not just his life but the future of Chicago. Armed with an improvised arsenal of protective gear and makeshift weapons, James headed for the heart of the cult, where the final ritual was about to begin. The mansion was even quieter than before, as if the very corridors were holding their breath. James moved with precision, his mind sharp and focused. He knew the ceremony was nearing its end and needed to act before the cult completed the ritual. As he approached the main room, he encountered a group of cultists guarding the entrance. Using a mix of stealth and force, James managed to neutralize the guards with techniques he had learned during his investigations and previous confrontations. He advanced cautiously, aware that the slightest distraction could draw the attention of the remaining cult members. He finally reached the room where the ritual was in full swing. The altar was covered with esoteric artifacts and lit candles, casting a dim and sinister light. The cultists were in a collective trance, chanting in an ancient tongue, while a leader, wearing a golden mask and ceremonial robe, conducted the ceremony. James observed for a moment, realizing that the cult was about to conclude the ritual with a human sacrifice, which would strengthen the entity's influence and allow them to gain even greater control over the city. His vision was blurred with anger and fear at what might happen if he didn't stop the cult. With a determined shout, James burst into the room, disrupting the ritual with a surge of action. He attacked the cultists with a mix of precision and brute force, disarming and knocking them down. The cult leader, initially surprised, tried to react, but James managed to disarm him and interrupt his conduct of the ritual. The environment turned into chaos. The candles fell and went out, and the altar was toppled, scattering esoteric artifacts and symbols everywhere. The cultists, now without the protection of the ritual, were disoriented and confused. James fought them off, using every moment to prevent the leader from regaining control of the ceremony. In a final act of desperation, the cult leader tried to invoke the entities directly, using an ancient artifact he had kept hidden. James, with the help of some techniques and knowledge gained during his investigation, managed to disarm the artifact and thwart the invocation attempt. With the ritual interrupted and the cult in disarray, James made a critical decision. He used the ancient device he had found in the tunnels to create a protective barrier around the room, preventing the entities from influencing the city again. The artifact was designed to seal and dissipate evil energies, and now, with the cult defeated, James was able to activate it. The chaos in the room slowly subsided, and the cult leader, now captured and incapacitated, was taken into custody. The weight of what had happened seemed to weigh on James, but he knew the battle was won, at least for now. As the first light of dawn began to illuminate the city of Chicago, James looked at the ruined mansion, the city still struggling to recover. He knew that the confrontation was only part of a longer cycle of fighting against the occult and the unknown. But for now, the victory was his, and the city had a chance to breathe freely once more. After the defeat of the cult and the interruption of the ritual, Chicago seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. James had dismantled the dark operation and prevented the rise of the entities. The city was waking up to a new day, but the sense of victory was mixed with a deep feeling of unease. Something was still unresolved, and James knew he couldn't relax just yet. In the days that followed, James dedicated himself to reviewing everything he had discovered. He examined every note, every symbol, and every piece of information he had collected during his journey. The cult's mansion was under investigation, and the authorities were starting to dismantle what remained of the secret operation. However, James felt that there was something deeper, something that still hadn't been revealed. One night, while reviewing the old diary he had found, James made a disturbing discovery. One of the diary's pages mentioned a final awakening, an event that would not only end the entity's influence but also reveal the true extent of their presence. What troubled him most was the mention of a key to the awakening, an artifact or knowledge that could alter everything he thought he knew. James immediately began searching for clues about this key. He revisited the tunnels, the old documents, and even the more forgotten parts of the city. During one of his investigations, he found an old map he had not noticed before. The map seemed to point to a specific location in Chicago, a place associated with historically significant hidden events. Following the map, James arrived at an old, abandoned chapel located in a rarely visited part of the city. The building was covered in vines and appeared to have been out of use for a long time. The chapel had a sinister aura, as if it had been waiting for someone. James entered, his flashlight illuminating the broken stained glass and the dust-covered altar. On the altar, he found a secret compartment. Inside it was a small safe covered with inscriptions and symbols matching those he had found in the tunnels. With a combination of physical and mental effort, James managed to open the safe, revealing an ancient manuscript and a peculiar artifact, a golden key with esoteric symbols engraved on it. The manuscript described a final ritual that needed to be performed to seal the entities once and for all and ensure their influence would never be a threat to the city again. The instructions were complex and required a deep understanding of what James had learned so far. He realized that the ritual needed to be performed at the same location where the entities had tried to invoke their power, a place of profound ritualistic significance. James prepared for the execution of the ritual, with the manuscript and the key in hand. He knew the process would be dangerous, but it was the only way to ensure that the entities would not return. He went back to the now deserted cult mansion and headed to the site where the original ritual had been interrupted. With the key and the manuscript, James began setting up the location for the final ritual. He drew the necessary symbols and arranged the artifacts as described. The tension was palpable, and each step seemed to carry the weight of his entire journey. When everything was ready, James began the ritual, reciting the words from the manuscript with determination. The key was placed in the center of the altar, and a brilliant light began to emanate, filling the room with a powerful, pulsating energy. The surrounding environment started to vibrate, and James felt a powerful force reacting to the ritual. It was as if he was fighting against an invisible tide, but with each word and gesture, he felt he was playing a crucial role in Chicago's salvation. The bright light grew and eventually faded, leaving the place in a state of peace and calm. When the ritual was over, James was exhausted, but a sense of accomplishment and relief washed over him. He had done what was necessary to ensure the entities were finally sealed and that Chicago could have a new beginning. Yet, even with the victory, he knew the world was full of mysteries, and the fight against the unknown never truly ended. The sun was shining over Chicago, bringing a sense of renewal after a night of terror and battle. James was in a state of exhaustion, but there was a new sense of peace in the city, as if the tension and fear that had hung over it were finally dissipating. He walked into the street, watching the city awaken from a nightmare that had seemed endless. As he walked, James couldn't help but reflect on the journey he had faced. Each step felt lighter, and there was a feeling that something had changed irreversibly. Yet, he sensed there was more to discover, something that could shed new light on what had happened. The afternoon was advancing when James received an unexpected visit. A messenger from a historical foundation in Chicago, specializing in preserving the city's darker aspects, sought him out. The foundation was interested in the recent events and wanted to discuss the details with James. Initially skeptical, he accepted the invitation, wanting to understand more about what had really occurred. Arriving at the Foundation's headquarters, an old library that resembled more of a fortress than a research center, James was greeted by a group of historians and experts eager to hear his story. They led him to a conference room filled with old books, documents, and historical artifacts. The Foundation's director, an elderly man with a penetrating gaze, listened attentively to James's account, taking notes as he spoke. After James finished, the director gestured for him to look at an old map of the city, one that James recognized immediately as one of the maps he had found in his own research. The director began explaining the connection between the cult and a series of historical events in Chicago. He revealed that the cult had been a secret part of the city's history since the late 19th century, having attempted several times to conduct rituals to summon entities and take control of Chicago. The city, with its rich history of immigration and growth, had been a fertile ground for these occult practices. James was astonished to learn that the cult was not just an isolated organization but part of a broader network of hidden influences spanning generations. The entities he had faced were linked to a cycle of events dating back long before his own experience. What he had defeated was not just a cult, it was a manifestation of a force that had been trying to shape the city's fate for decades. The director continued, revealing that the manuscript and key James had used in the final ritual were part of an ancient set of artifacts intended to keep these forces in check. Each time one of these forces was sealed, another part of the cycle began, with new cults emerging to try to complete what had been interrupted. James was perplexed to understand that his victory, while significant, was only part of an endless cycle of confrontation with the occult. He realized that Chicago was steeped in a history of invisible and powerful forces that continued to fight from the shadows. The director handed James a copy of an old journal containing additional information about the city's hidden history and other similar events that would occur at different times. There was a sense that the struggle was not completely over, and James would need to be prepared for what came next. As James left the Foundation, he felt a mix of relief and apprehension. He had dismantled a significant part of the cult and sealed the entities, but the final revelation made it clear that the battle against the occult forces was an ongoing struggle. Chicago had been liberated, but the world was full of mysteries and challenges waiting to be uncovered. James knew his journey was far from over. With the city now safer, he prepared for what would come next, aware that the search for answers and the fight against the unknown would continue to shape his destiny and that of Chicago. The final revelation was a grim reminder that, no matter what he had achieved, the quest for answers and the battle against the occult would never truly end.